December 25, 1989. On this day, the world watched a fortress crumble live on television. The most rigid communist regime in Eastern Europe collapsed not in years, but in hours. At the center stood Nicolae Ceaușescu and his wife, Elena. They ruled with absolute control. They weaponized hunger and propaganda. Why did the population endure it for decades? It wasn't respect. It was terror. The personality cult was so intense that Romanians feared whispering the dictator's name in their own homes. At first glance, a stable government, but in reality, a house of cards. The footage shows the couple fleeing the palace roof in a helicopter, but there was no escape. Events accelerated. The military switched sides. The trial was one of the fastest in the 20th century. It lasted less than 2 hours. Elena stood before a firing squad. The soldiers didn't wait. They opened fire immediately. 120 bullets. That was the final verdict delivered by the firing squad. The execution followed one of the fastest trials of the 20th century. The proceedings lasted less than 2 hours. But the road to that concrete wall began decades earlier, in total obscurity. January 7, 1916. Elena Petrescu was born in the village of Petreci, deep in southern Romania. The region was poor. The house had cold floors. Her family worked the land from dawn until dusk. Survival was the only priority. Education was a luxury they could not afford. Elena attended primary school for only a few years. The archives show her grades were failing. She struggled to read. Writing was a near impossible task. She left school with nothing but basic needlework skills. As a teenager, she left the village. She moved to Bucharest to escape the mud and the poverty. She found a job at a textile factory. The noise of the looms was deafening. Later, she secured a position as a laboratory assistant at the Institute of Chemistry. She washed test tubes. She swept floors. It was low-level work. How did an uneducated laborer rise to the pinnacle of power? Logic suggests she should have remained invisible. But the underground world of politics operated by different rules. The monarchy still ruled Romania. The Communist Party was banned. Police hunted its members. Yet, in 1939, Elena officially joined the party. That same year, she met him, Nicolae Ceaușescu. He was 5 years younger than her. He was small and intense. He was already a veteran of the underground. Nicolae had been arrested multiple times. He knew the dampness of prison cells. He was a fanatic. Elena and Nicolae formed a partnership. It was not just romance, it was a political pact. They bonded over shared enemies and shared ambition. World War II ended. The map of Europe changed. The Soviet Union extended its grip over Romania. 1947. King Michael was forced to abdicate. The monarchy fell. The People's Republic was declared. Soviet tanks guaranteed the transition. The Communist Party seized the state apparatus. Nicolae began his ascent. He served under the iron fist of Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej. Elena stayed in the shadows. She did not hold a high title. Instead, she worked inside the party bureaucracy. She handled the files. She watched the rivals. She ensured Nicolae was protected. At first glance, a loyal wife. But in reality, a ruthless operator clearing the path for her husband. 1965. Gheorghiu-Dej died. The power vacuum opened. Nicolae stepped in as the new general secretary. Under his command, Romania began to distance itself from Moscow. He wanted absolute control. Elena's visibility exploded. She still had no academic background. She could barely write a coherent sentence. Yet, the state apparatus began to fabricate a genius. The footage shows Elena accepting honorary degrees with a stern face. She was appointed to the Romanian Academy in 1965. Scientists were forced to write papers in her name. Universities granted her titles she could not read. The fraud was open, but no one dared to speak. Events accelerated. In 1971, the couple traveled to Asia. They visited China and North Korea. They saw the massive parades. They saw the cult of personality. They saw a population that did not question its leaders. The camera records, Nicolae and Elena smiling as thousands chant their names in Pyongyang. They did not just observe. They took notes. They decided to bring this total control back to Bucharest. The trip changed everything. 1971. That was the turning point for an entire nation. Nicolae Ceaușescu returned from his visit to China and North Korea with a new vision. He did not bring back trade deals. He brought back the July Theses. It was a cultural revolution on paper. In practice, it was a suffocating blanket of strict ideological control. Censorship increased immediately. This marked the true beginning of the Ceaușescu personality cult. Nicolae did not stand alone on the pedestal. Elena's image began to saturate public life. She was no longer just a wife. She was promoted as the ultimate national role model. The target audience was specific: women and the youth. Why did the regime push her into the spotlight? It seemed unnecessary for a dictator's absolute power, but the goal was a dynasty. Two icons were harder to topple than one. The state apparatus aggressively crafted a new reality. The propaganda machine officially presented her as a brilliant scientist. She was the mother of the nation. She was a leading figure in international politics. Her official title became mandatory: Dr. Engineer Elena Ceaușescu. At public events, announcers did not simply say her name. They read long, exaggerated lists of honors and awards into the microphone. 1974. Elena was appointed head of the National Council for Science and Technology. At first glance, an administrative promotion, but in reality, a hostile takeover of Romanian intellect. She had limited education. She possessed zero proven contributions to actual research. Yet, this position gave her direct control over every scientific institution in Romania. She held the purse strings for research grants. She dictated academic appointments. But control was not enough. She demanded adoration. Romanian chemists faced a grim choice. They were routinely forced to cite Elena in their work. They had to credit her for discoveries she had no part in. They had to attend events and praise her genius. To refuse was to destroy one's career. The footage shows rows of scientists applauding mechanically in cold lecture halls. Diplomatic channels worked overtime to secure her honorary degrees from foreign universities. It was a coordinated effort to legitimize a lie. State media produced endless documentaries glorifying her career. Articles and books praised her intelligence. These materials were not just printed, they were distributed across the country in massive volumes. There was no escape from her face. Elena's image was placed beside Nicolae's on giant banners. Posters covered the walls of government buildings. Her profile appeared on the national currency. The indoctrination reached into the classrooms. Children in schools were required to memorize facts about her scientific accomplishments. Women's organizations received orders to present her as the standard for all Romanian women. The charade culminated in the highest titles. She was awarded Hero of Socialist Labor. She was named a full member of the Romanian Academy. The country's highest academic body was now subject to her will. Science had surrendered to the dictator. One signature was often enough to destroy a career. She sat in the Politburo, the absolute peak of the Communist Party, and wielded power that rivaled the dictator himself. She didn't just observe state planning, she dictated it. Personnel changes, ideological enforcement, economic shifts, everything passed through her hands. Officials who displeased her didn't just lose their jobs, they disappeared from public life. Her temper became legendary within the inner circle. Generals and ministers walked on eggshells. Obtaining a high-level promotion was impossible without her personal approval. While the nation tightened its belt, the Ceaușescus lived in a separate reality. They occupied the Spring Palace in Bucharest, a fortress of opulence. They had access to imported luxury items that ordinary citizens had not seen in decades. Fine leathers, Western electronics, exotic fruits. Basic goods like meat, sugar, and gas were rationed for the population. But for the ruling couple and their few close allies, special supply lines ensured constant abundance. Their medical care was state-of-the-art. Their security was absolute. 1981, the bill came due. Romania's foreign debt hit $11 billion. It was a massive burden for a struggling economy. To fix it, Nicolae Ceaușescu ordered a brutal austerity program. Elena did not object. She supported the decision fully. The goal was to repay every cent to foreign creditors immediately. The social cost was irrelevant. Why did they choose starvation over debt? It seemed like national pride, but in reality, it was a fanatical obsession. The government slashed imports instantly. Food, fuel, and medicine stopped crossing the border. Industrial production took priority over human survival. Elena took personal control of scientific and industrial targets. She interfered constantly. She issued orders on technical matters she did not understand. Engineers stood silent. Correcting her was dangerous. Her commands were final, even when they defied the laws of physics or economics. Productivity collapsed, but the propaganda machine insisted the country was advancing. It got worse. By 1982, the lights went out. Electricity and gas usage were strictly rationed. Power outages became a daily routine. In many urban areas, hot water flowed through the pipes only once a week. Winter arrived and the heating systems were reduced or cut off entirely. Inside concrete apartment blocks, temperatures dropped below freezing. Families slept in coats and hats. Hospitals lacked basic equipment. Rural clinics were understaffed. Essential medications vanished from pharmacy shelves. The footage shows empty metal racks in a grocery store where bread should be. Food shortages became severe. The government introduced strict rationing cards for bread, meat, and milk. The struggle for calories consumed daily life. People lined up for hours. They started queuing before dawn, standing in the dark and cold. Often they reached the front only to find the shelves bare. In cities like Bucharest, gas restrictions forced citizens to rely on electric cookers. This strained the grid further, causing more blackouts. At first glance, a queue for groceries, but in reality, a daily battle for survival. Elena pushed for total self-sufficiency. She demanded that Romanian agriculture and pharmaceuticals meet all domestic needs. But the policies were based on fantasy. She controlled the National Council for Science and Technology and used it as a bludgeon. She forced unrealistic quotas and production targets on terrified subordinates. Factory managers faced a grim choice. They could admit failure or they could lie. Those who failed to meet the goals risked demotion, public shaming, or worse. There was no turning back. While the people froze, the Ceaușescus enjoyed uninterrupted comfort. They continued their diplomatic tours. They traveled to China, Iran, and North Korea on official state visits. The camera records, the couple stepping off a plane, greeted by military bands and flowers. These trips were funded with public money. They attended grand receptions and exchanged costly gifts. Entourages of dozens of aides and bodyguards followed them everywhere. They dined at banquets while Romanian citizens struggled to survive the night. The country was dying, but the party went on. 11,000 officers. That was the official count of the Securitate by the mid-1980s. But behind the uniformed men stood an invisible army. Nearly 500,000 informants monitored the population. The ratio was suffocating. 1 in every 30 Romanians was watching the other 29. They listened in factories. They watched in neighborhoods. They bugged private homes. The Securitate knew what you ate for dinner and who you cursed under your breath. Survival was the only goal for the citizens. Expressing doubt was a crime. A whispered complaint led to a metal interrogation room. Threats followed, then prison. Foreign reporters were banned, but the truth leaked out like gas. The scene is tense. A family gathers in the dark, tuning a dial. Static crackles. The voice of Radio Free Europe cuts through the noise. They listened at great risk. Caught in the act meant disappearance. International organizations published reports on the torture and the hunger. The regime dismissed every word. They called it lies from the West. By 1986, Elena Ceaușescu was untouchable. She secured her seat on the Political Executive Committee. She took command of national commissions for science and education. Ministers with degrees bowed to her. She overruled experts without hesitation. Her authority extended into sectors where she had zero competence. Yet her signature carried the weight of law. Why did educated men obey an uneducated woman? It seemed like madness, but refusing her meant professional suicide. As Romania cut ties with both the West and the East, Elena tightened the screws. She forced ideology into algebra. Biology became politics. Students did not just study history, they memorized the lives of Nicolae and Elena. During exams, they recited passages about the couple's genius. Failure to praise them was failure to graduate. At first glance, a booming literary culture. But in reality, a factory of lies. Critics vanished from universities, playwrights faced the censor's red pen. Elena demanded validation. She ordered teams of ghostwriters to churn out scientific papers under her name. But this was only the surface. Whole publishing houses worked solely for her vanity. These books were translated into English, French, and German. They were piled onto tables at international conferences, a fraud printed on high-quality paper. While Elena accepted medals for research she never did, the world around her shifted. 1988 brought a wind of change to the east. Hungary opened its borders. The Solidarity movement rose in Poland. Even Moscow changed. Mikhail Gorbachev introduced glasnost. He spoke of openness and restructuring. But in Bucharest, the doors slammed shut. Elena and Nicolae viewed reform as an infection. They declared that Romania would stand alone. Television anchors read scripts attacking foreign poisons. The citizens saw nothing of the outside world. The state fed them narratives of stability while their stomachs grumbled. The footage shows lines for bread stretching around city blocks. People wait hours for a liter of milk. Scarcity defined daily existence. Surveillance defined the nights. Intelligence reports landed on Elena's desk. They described a population near the breaking point. She threw them away. She refused to look at the data. She called the hungry citizens traitors and demanded absolute loyalty from the starving masses. Diplomatic allies abandoned them. The economy flatlined. Even loyal party members checked their exits. Yet, Elena remained blind. She stood on balconies surrounded by generals, convinced the applause was real. The camera records. The crowd claps rhythmically, faces blank. No one smiles. Away from the staged ceremonies, the silence ended. Anger replaced fear. The system was a pressure cooker with the valve welded shut. Something had to give, and soon it would explode. December 15th, 1989. The spark finally ignited. In the city of Timișoara, the government moved to evict Laszlo Tokes. He was a Hungarian Reformed pastor, a known critic. The regime wanted him silenced, but his congregation had other plans. They surrounded his home. They formed a human shield. Locals joined the blockade, driven not just by solidarity, but by anger. Hunger, cold, and oppression had pushed them to the edge. The crowd swelled rapidly. Within 48 hours, a neighborhood dispute transformed into a citywide revolt. The chants grew louder. The authorities lost patience. December 17th. The order came down. The military and the dreaded Securitate opened fire. They did not aim for the legs. They aimed to kill. Over 60 unarmed civilians died on the pavement that day. Hundreds more were wounded or dragged away in handcuffs. The aftermath was brutal. Bodies were loaded onto trucks under the cover of darkness. They were transported secretly and buried in mass graves. The regime tried to erase the evidence. Why did the cover-up fail? The borders were sealed, but radio waves have no borders. Eyewitnesses whispered their stories to foreign journalists. Western radio stations broadcast the massacre back into Romania. The truth could no longer be hidden. By December 18th, the protests returned. They were bigger. Factories went silent as workers downed their tools. Students marched to the front lines. Security forces cracked down with batons and water cannons, but instead of fear, they met fury. The resistance hardened. By December 20th, the army units in Timișoara stopped shooting. They pulled back. Timișoara declared itself the first free city of Romania. But in Bucharest, the dictator was blind to reality. December 21st, Nicolae Ceaușescu had just returned from Iran. He needed to reassert control. He organized a mass rally in the capital's central square. It was meant to be a show of absolute power, broadcast live to the entire nation. 80,000 people were bussed in. They were handed banners and ordered to cheer. The broadcast captures the moment clearly. Ceaușescu stands on the balcony. He begins his speech. Suddenly, a low rumble rises from the crowd. It isn't applause. At first glance, a technical glitch. But in reality, it was the sound of a regime collapsing. People began to boo. Cries of Timișoara erupted. Slogans were shouted. Banners were waved in defiance. In the frame, Ceaușescu's face freezes. He looks confused. He taps the microphone. He waves his hand weakly, demanding silence. Elena leans in, desperate to calm him, but the spell was broken. The transmission was cut abruptly. Chaos took over the streets. The crowd surged toward the Central Committee building. Clashes erupted with security forces. That night, Bucharest burned. Demonstrators lit fires at intersections. They built barricades. Riot police charged, but the people stood their ground. Gunfire crackled through the capital until dawn. Workers from nearby industrial zones poured into the city. The government lost control. Events accelerated. By the morning of December 22nd, news broke. Defense Minister Vasile Milea was dead. The official statement called it a suicide, but rumors spread instantly. He was executed for refusing to order the slaughter of civilians. His death triggered a massive shift. The army had seen enough. Units across Romania began to abandon the Ceaușescus. Tanks turned their turrets away from the people. Some soldiers joined the protesters, others simply refused to act. By noon on December 22nd, revolutionaries stormed the national television station. They went on air. A new temporary government, the National Salvation Front, was announced. The sound of an assault rifle bolt racking is audible in the streets. As gunfire echoed across Bucharest, the Ceaușescus ran. They fled the presidential headquarters in a white helicopter. A few loyal aides and bodyguards went with them. They lifted off just as the crowd breached the doors. But the sky was no longer safe. The airspace was monitored. Their flight path was tracked on radar. The pilot panicked. He feared anti-aircraft fire. He refused to fly further. He landed the machine near Titu, a town west of Bucharest. The couple hijacked a car. They attempted to hide in the countryside, but there was nowhere left to run. Local police and military officers located them. They were arrested quickly. The couple was transported under heavy guard to a military unit in Târgoviște, about 80 kilometers northwest of the capital. The commander of the garrison locked them in a room. He waited for orders. The trap had snapped shut. Zero authority. That was what remained the moment the heavy gates of the base closed behind them. Once inside, the Ceaușescus were stripped of their formal status instantly. They were no longer the parents of the nation. They were detainees. The transition was brutal. Their personal bodyguards were disarmed. Weapons clattered to the floor. The protectors were separated from the protected. Soldiers shoved the couple into a small room. The furniture was sparse. 2 metal-framed beds, plain military blankets. The windows were barred with heavy iron. Guards stood stationed outside the door. They watched around the clock. For the first time in decades, Nicolae and Elena had no access to aides, no advisors, no personal staff to anticipate their whims. Elena could not handle the silence. She was especially agitated. Soldiers reported she spoke constantly. She paced the small floor space. She demanded to speak to loyal comrades. She accused high-ranking officers of treason to their faces. She refused to believe the Central Committee had abandoned them. In her mind, the uprising was a foreign plot, a lie. Nicolae was different. He appeared quieter, withdrawn. But he also showed total disbelief that their regime had truly fallen. Why did he ask for a typewriter? He believed the party was still listening. He hoped to draft a declaration to his supporters. But the answer from the guards was short, denied. The reality of their confinement set in. No more banquets. They were fed standard army rations, boiled potatoes, stale bread, water in tin cups. They were not permitted to bathe. They could not change clothes. Both wore the same outfits they had fled Bucharest in. Nicolae sat in a simple wool coat. Elena wrapped herself in a heavy overcoat and scarf. The footage shows narrow cots under the glare of harsh electric lighting. Sleep was impossible. Guards inspected them frequently. Medical personnel checked them once daily. They confirmed the prisoners were in stable condition, physically alive, but politically dead. Outside the base, Romania was in chaos. Sporadic gunfire continued in several cities. The sound of automatic weapons echoed through the streets. There were rumors of possible counterattacks. Forces loyal to the old regime were still out there. Units of the Securitate had not yet surrendered. The newly formed National Salvation Front faced a crisis. Ion Iliescu and other former communists had broken away from the Ceaușescus, but they faced enormous pressure. Protesters screamed for action. Military commanders demanded orders. At first glance, the revolution had won. But in reality, the new leaders were terrified. People demanded immediate justice. There were growing fears that keeping the couple alive for too long could spark more bloodshed. Reports circulated that armed groups might try to rescue them. Their mere survival fueled rumors of a political comeback. The army leadership at the Târgoviște garrison became uneasy. Confusion reigned. Who was officially in charge? Would the Ceaușescus be transferred or executed? Events accelerated. By the evening of December 24th, the tension peaked. Closed-door talks in Bucharest lasted for hours. Arguments flared. Finally, the new leadership reached a decision. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu would be put on trial the next day. A military tribunal was assembled. The process would be swift. There would be no appeal. December 25th, 1989. The destination was not a prison cell, but the cold interior of the Târgoviște army base. The Ceaușescus arrived in an armored carrier. They were ushered into a small, nondescript room. Furniture was shoved together to form a makeshift tribunal. The air was stale. Tension made the room feel smaller than it was. Inside, a handful of military officials waited. General Ghica Popa and Prosecutor Dan Voinea sat behind the table. They were not there to judge. They were there to finish a process. Why was the rush so desperate? Legal protocols usually take months, but fear of a counterattack by the secret police was stronger than the law. The trial began at 1:20 in the afternoon. There was no jury. There was no audience. The couple had no prior access to legal counsel. Their court-assigned lawyer, Nicolae Teodorescu, had arrived only minutes earlier. He did not offer comfort. He barely spoke to them. He sat down, ready to accept the inevitable. The camera records. The footage is grainy and shaky. The lighting is poor. In the frame, Nicolae and Elena sit side by side, still wearing their heavy winter coats. They look cornered. Prosecutor Voinea read the charges. 5 counts in total. Genocide, armed attack on the people, destruction of the economy, attempting to flee with state funds. The prosecutor cited a specific number, 60,000 dead. This figure was an exaggeration by the court. Years later, investigations would place the toll closer to 1,100. But in that room, the higher number was treated as absolute fact. The charge also covered decades of starvation and cold that the population had endured. Elena did not sit quietly. She became combative. She interrupted the prosecutor repeatedly. She shouted at the officers. She slammed her hand on the chair. She called the proceedings a farce and refused to answer questions. Nicolae was slightly more composed, but equally defiant. He adjusted his scarf. He refused to recognize the tribunal's authority. To him, the men across the table were traitors and foreign agents. He demanded to speak only to the Grand National Assembly. But the judges had their instructions. They cut off the speeches. They pressed forward. There was no turning back. Standard procedures were ignored. No evidence files were opened. No witnesses were called to the stand. The defense lawyer did not cross-examine. He did not try to save them. At first glance, a legal proceeding, but in reality, a finalized execution order. The guards stood with fingers near their triggers. They knew the situation outside was critical. Chaos was unfolding across Romania. Gunfire was still echoing in Bucharest. The session lasted less than 2 hours. Just before 2:45, the verdict was read. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was death. There would be no appeal. There would be no delay. The execution was to be carried out immediately. The new leadership believed a live dictator meant a continuing war. They needed a body to prove the regime was dead. Delaying the sentence could invite a rescue attempt by loyalist forces. The decision was signed in minutes. The soldiers outside the courtroom checked their weapons. They received their final orders. The execution would happen right there, within the walls of the compound. Less than 5 minutes. That was the duration of the entire procedure, from the moment the couple entered the yard to the final silence. Nicolae and Elena were hurried out of the makeshift courtroom. Soldiers pushed them directly into the freezing air of the Târgoviște military base. It was a bleak winter afternoon. Snow covered the concrete ground. Captain Ionel Boeru led the execution squad. He had selected 2 other soldiers from a unit of elite paratroopers. Why were they chosen so quickly? There was no time for complex protocols. The new government needed men willing to pull the trigger immediately. The guards dragged the Ceaușescus toward the center of the courtyard. They allowed no time for final statements. There were no last requests. The audio recording captures the chaos. Elena shouts at the officers. She demands that the soldiers do not separate her from her husband. She insists they face the firing squad together. Her denial is absolute. Even in these final seconds, she screams that the court has no authority. She claims they are still the rightful rulers of Romania. Nicolae attempted to maintain his composure, but his body betrayed him. He appeared pale. His physical strength had vanished. The soldiers grabbed his wrists to bind them with rope. His hands were trembling uncontrollably. Elena fought back, but she too was bound. The guards shoved the couple against a plain wall in a corner of the courtyard. This location was not chosen for ceremony. It was chosen because the surface was solid enough to stop the bullets. At first glance, a military execution. But in reality, a frantic liquidation. The order came instantly. Captain Boru and his team raised their automatic rifles. They fired a long, sustained volley. Dozens of bullets tore into the couple. The impact threw them back against the masonry. Dust and smoke filled the cold air. Reports state they died instantly. Medical confirmation was a mere formality that came seconds later. The camera records. The bodies slumped to the snowy ground. A single army cameraman filmed the sequence. This footage was not for the archives, it was raw proof. The new leaders needed to show both the Romanian people and the outside world that the Ceaușescu regime was physically dead. But the story did not end with the gunshots. Days later, the edited footage appeared on national television. Millions of Romanians gathered around their screens. For the first time, they saw the dictator's lifeless body with their own eyes. The myth of his immortality was broken. The cleanup was unceremonious. Soldiers lifted the corpses into plain wooden coffins. A helicopter transported the cargo to Bucharest. They were buried in the Ghența military cemetery. There were no marble monuments. At first, the graves remained unmarked. The authorities feared that loyalists would turn the site into a pilgrimage destination. Only later did small, simple headstones appear. The execution signaled the total collapse of communist rule. Romania began its difficult pivot toward democracy. However, the legacy of the Ceaușescus left deep scars on the national psyche. Elena became the primary symbol of the regime's arrogance. Her reputation crumbled. Institutions stripped her name from their titles. Researchers exposed her academic papers as frauds. Her scientific awards were revoked posthumously. She was remembered not as a scientist, but as a cruel amateur who held absolute power. Years passed. Conspiracy theories flourished. Some critics argued the trial was a sham. Others claimed the process was too rushed to be legal. But most Romanians agreed on one fact: the era of fear was over. In the 2000s, public interest returned to the cemetery. The family demanded certainty. In 2010, authorities exhumed the remains. Forensic experts conducted DNA testing. The results were conclusive. The bodies buried in the frozen ground at Ghența were indeed Nicolae and Elena. The file was finally closed.